Power doesn't always come with sharp edges. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in softness, disguised as care. They smile. They listen. They remember small details, the name of your pet, the story about your childhood, the moment you almost cried. And that's where the first cut is made. Not on your skin, but somewhere deeper. A place you can't show anyone, because it feels like trust. You mistake attention for safety. You mistake understanding for loyalty. But what they were really doing was studying you. Every fear, every regret, every hidden insecurity you ever revealed, stored like ammunition, waiting for the right moment. That's how emotional leverage begins. Because control doesn't start with dominance. It starts with empathy. Weaponized empathy. Most people never see it coming. Because the human brain is wired for connection. We crave to be seen, and manipulators exploit that craving with surgical precision. They know that the easiest way to control someone isn't through force, it's through emotional reflection. They mirror your pain until you let them in. They become your confidant, your safe space, your emotional home. And then, once you're inside, they lock the doors. Here's the cruel truth. The moment you open your heart, you hand over the map to your destruction. Because no one can wound you more precisely than the one who knows where you hide your fears. It doesn't happen all at once. First comes comfort, then dependency, then guilt. That's the emotional sequence of captivity. They don't demand obedience, they inspire it. They make you want to please them, to earn back the approval they once gave so freely. It's the same psychology used in interrogation rooms, cults, and toxic relationships. Intermittent reinforcement, reward, withdrawal, reward again. It keeps your mind addicted, chasing closure that never comes. And you tell yourself, they didn't mean it. They were just hurt. They'll change. But what you don't realize is, you've already surrendered. Because the one who explains is always beneath the one who judges. They no longer need to shout. Your mind does the work for them. You censor yourself before they even have to. You apologize for boundaries that should never need defense. That's when you know the weapon has entered you, silently, elegantly, permanently. Emotional leverage is not built on cruelty. It's built on access. And access is something you give, not something they take. That's what makes it so devastating. They don't destroy your confidence outright. They erode it slowly, through subtle comments, through delayed affection, through comparisons so faint you barely notice. You start adjusting your tone, your clothes, your behavior, not because they asked you to, but because you fear they might disapprove. That's how control feels when it's dressed as love. Here's what they don't tell you. Manipulators don't want to break you. They want to shape you. They want to sculpt your emotions into something predictable, compliant, and useful. To them, your tears are currency. Your guilt is obedience. Your forgiveness is the rope they'll use to pull you back every time you try to escape. You'll know you've fallen under their leverage when you start defending them to others. When you hide the things they do because you understand them, because you believe you're the exception. But exceptions are the most dangerous illusion. That's where the manipulator's power becomes sacred in your eyes. They'll tell you stories about their pain, their loneliness, their broken past, and you'll confuse empathy with intimacy. But empathy, in the wrong hands, becomes hypnosis. It keeps you emotionally invested in a person who's already decided you're a resource, not a partner. There's no weapon sharper than emotional access. And the tragedy is, it feels good before it hurts. It feels like belonging. It feels like home. Until one day, it feels like prison. Because the people who learn your softest truths are the ones who can most easily redefine them. Your openness becomes their leverage. Your kindness becomes their manipulation point. And your silence becomes their safety net. When you finally begin to pull away, they'll sense it instantly. They'll remind you of the moments you shared, the ones that still ache in your memory. They'll say, after everything we've been through, as if history itself should be a leash. But that's when you must remember, history is not loyalty, attachment is not love, and emotional investment is not debt. Every time you share your pain, ask yourself, have they earned this access or have they engineered it? Because the difference between the two decides whether you'll be free or owned. Emotional leverage isn't loud. It's quiet. It's a whisper disguised as comfort. And once you recognize it, you start to see it everywhere. In relationships, in workplaces, in families. People who act helpless to make you responsible. People who use guilt to make you obedient. People who reward your loyalty with just enough warmth to keep you near. They don't force the chains. You build them yourself, out of love, out of fear, out of hope that one day they'll see the real you. But they already do. That's the problem. They've studied every corner of your softness, and they know exactly how to make you believe that your vulnerability is your virtue, when it's really their weapon. And once you see that, you can never unsee it, because control isn't taken by force. It's offered through trust. And the first person who teaches you that lesson will never be forgotten. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when care turns into control. It doesn't announce itself with cruelty. It slips in through warmth, through concern, through the small, invisible hooks buried in words like, "I just want what's best for you." And you believe them. Because why wouldn't you? That's the brilliance of psychological leverage. It hides inside what looks like love. They ask for honesty, but what they really want is intel. They encourage vulnerability, but what they're collecting is currency. Every confession becomes collateral. The human brain is built on reciprocity. We share because sharing builds safety. But in the mind of a manipulator, your openness is not sacred. It's strategic. They understand what most never learn. Information equals influence. And influence, once obtained, doesn't need force, it needs suggestion. The deeper science behind this is terrifyingly simple. When you open up emotionally, your brain releases oxytocin, the same chemical responsible for trust, intimacy, and maternal bonding. It's a neurological surrender. It tells your mind, this person is safe. But manipulators exploit that chemical moment. They trigger your oxytocin release to make you dependent on their approval. Then, they withdraw it, suddenly, sharply, leaving you starved for emotional oxygen. That withdrawal is not accidental. It's calibration. They condition you to crave their validation. And when you chase it, you no longer think, you obey. You'll hear phrases like, "You've changed lately. I don't feel like you care anymore. You used to be different." Each line is a mirror held up to make you doubt your reflection. You begin performing, unconsciously editing yourself to earn back their warmth. That's the paradox. You think you're regaining connection, but you're really tightening their grip. What they don't tell you is this. Control is rarely maintained by strength. It's maintained by confusion. As long as you're second-guessing yourself, you won't question them. And confusion feels safer than confrontation. This is why emotional manipulators never seek full dominance. They prefer partial control, just enough to keep you uncertain, but still functional. They want your productivity, not your collapse. Your attention, not your rebellion. They master the art of the invisible leash, the one you willingly wear because it feels like stability. You might think you can reason with them. You'll prepare your arguments, your explanations, your proof. But they're not fighting for truth. They're fighting for control of perception. Their logic isn't designed to resolve. It's designed to exhaust, to make you surrender not because they're right, but because you're tired. Here's the cruel truth. When you find yourself explaining too much, you're already losing power. Because every justification you give feeds their dominance loop. They stand calm, composed, quietly watching as you unravel, and they learn exactly which words unspool you fastest. At that point, they don't need to argue anymore. They just need to pause. That silence, that pause, becomes punishment. You'll feel it as anxiety, as emptiness, as the desperate need to fix what feels broken. That's when the real conditioning begins. They use absence like a weapon. Every time you try to assert a boundary, they withdraw affection. Every time you express independence, they create emotional distance. Until your nervous system associates self-respect with loss. You start to believe that autonomy equals abandonment. That's how deep emotional leverage cuts, not into your confidence, but into your biology. Your mind begins to self-police. Your body betrays your independence by craving their approval. This isn't love. It's training. And the moment you start adjusting your authenticity to preserve peace, the power exchange has already occurred. But here's the paradox that every strategist must learn. Control is never complete without your consent. They can manipulate, deceive, and provoke, but they can't force you to believe them. That's the last fortress left, your interpretation of reality. And that's exactly where they'll aim next. They'll start rewriting your memories. They'll question your recollection of events. It didn't happen that way. You're too sensitive. You always overreact. Gaslighting isn't just distortion. It's a psychological erasure. It deletes the version of you that once trusted your own perception. And once you doubt your senses, you become dependent on theirs. This is the final stage of emotional leverage. Reality replacement. You no longer argue over what's true. You argue over what's real. And the one who defines reality controls everything. It's Machiavellian in essence. The one who defines the narrative rules the kingdom. That's the silent principle of emotional domination. Control the story, and you control the mind. Because the human mind doesn't fight truth, it fights uncertainty. And manipulators weaponize uncertainty until you stop asking questions altogether. But there's something they don't anticipate. A quiet shift that happens when the pain becomes instructional. When you start to see the pattern not as personal betrayal, but as behavioral design. That's when the illusion begins to crack. Because awareness, once ignited, cannot be unlearned. You begin to see their charm for what it is, a calculated currency. Their care, an investment with expected returns. Their silence, a method of control. And slowly, the balance begins to reverse. They think they still hold power over you, but in truth, you've already stepped outside their frame. They're playing a game whose rules you no longer follow. That's when you realize something profound. You were never weak. You were untrained. And now, you're starting to learn the language of control. Because understanding manipulation doesn't make you cold. It makes you sovereign. It teaches you the difference between being loving and being leveraged. And when you finally internalize that truth, their power begins to fade. Not because you fought harder, but because you stopped feeding it. The emotional hooks that once pierced you lose their grip the moment you stop bleeding for validation. That's when silence becomes your shield. That's when stillness becomes defiance. That's when you stop reacting and start observing. And from that point on, everything changes. They say guilt is proof of a conscience. But in the wrong hands, guilt is a leash. A quiet one. Invisible, but unbreakable. Especially when it's wrapped around your heart. You felt it before. The sick, heavy weight that presses on your chest when you try to pull away. When you finally set a boundary and they sigh, disappointed, not angry, just hurt. And somehow, that hurts you more. That's emotional warfare disguised as morality. And it's far more powerful than anger. Here's the hidden rule of dark psychology. The one who controls your guilt controls your behavior. They don't need to demand compliance when you'll punish yourself on their behalf. That's the brilliance of emotional leverage. It doesn't command. It conditions. They create a feedback loop of obligation so deep that your empathy becomes your prison. You start asking for permission to breathe, to rest, to feel. You become addicted to their forgiveness, a forgiveness they weaponize by withholding. Psychologists call this learned guilt conditioning. It's the same mechanism that keeps abused dogs submissive to cruel owners. A cycle of reward and remorse so unpredictable that the subject stops resisting altogether. They stop seeking fairness and start seeking approval. And approval is always just out of reach. Here's what they don't tell you. Guilt doesn't just shape emotion, it reshapes identity. When someone repeatedly ties your worth to their comfort, you begin to view your boundaries as cruelty. You begin to feel shame for protecting yourself. And once you feel shame for self-preservation, you've surrendered the final defense. Manipulators understand this instinctively. They build their control around it. Their favorite phrases all share a single undertone. You owe me. You're being selfish. After everything I've done for you, I thought you were different. Each statement carries a hidden blade, a suggestion that your independence equals betrayal, that your silence equals punishment, that your truth equals cruelty, and you fall for it. because you've been conditioned to believe that good people always repair what's broken, even when they didn't break it. So you keep fixing what was never yours to fix. You keep apologizing for the peace you were never given. That's the trap. You start to measure morality by their emotions, not your integrity. And that's when you lose the plot, because now every decision you make is filtered through the fear of disappointing them. They've successfully replaced your internal compass with their approval. And in that moment, you stop being autonomous. You become programmable. Most people think manipulation looks like threats or domination. But the most dangerous manipulators don't raise their voice. They lower it. They use disappointment as a scalpel. They speak in soft tones that make you question if you're the villain for wanting peace. They say, "I just don't understand you anymore." And somehow, you end up apologizing for your clarity. That's how they rewrite morality, by turning guilt into gravity. The more you try to rise, the heavier it pulls you down. Here's the dark paradox. The more empathic you are, the more susceptible you become to guilt manipulation. Because empathy makes you absorb emotions that don't belong to you. You start to feel responsible for someone else's suffering. And once you accept that responsibility, they own you. They don't need to cage you physically. You'll cage yourself with your own conscience. But here's where the awakening begins. When you start to see guilt not as proof of goodness, but as data. When you pause and ask, is this guilt earned or imposed? Because not all guilt is moral. Some is manufactured. True guilt guides you toward integrity. False guilt guides you toward servitude. And most never learn the difference. You'll know it's false when your guilt doesn't lead to growth. It leads to obedience. When you apologize and nothing changes. When you explain and they still look unsatisfied. That's not reconciliation. That's programming. And yet, when you stop reacting to guilt, when you let it pass through you without explanation, something strange happens. They panic. They'll accuse you of being heartless. They'll say you've changed. They'll call you cold. But what they're really saying is this: you've stopped responding to my control. Because guilt manipulation only works when you believe your peace must come at someone else's expense. Once you stop accepting that equation, you become untouchable. That's when silence stops being passive and becomes power. It's not detachment. It's self-ownership. It's you refusing to feed the cycle with endless emotional explanations. You start realizing that empathy, when unguarded, is self-erasure. And that real compassion sometimes looks like distance, because distance is clarity, and clarity exposes manipulation faster than confrontation ever could. You begin to notice their reactions, not their words. The flinch when you say no, the sudden silence when you stop apologizing, the manufactured sadness when you hold your boundary. Each reaction is data, proof that their affection was conditional all along, and in that realization, guilt loses its gravity. You begin to rise again, not angrily, not vindictively, just quietly, because now you see that guilt isn't a sign of conscience. It's a weapon, one you can finally stop turning against yourself. From this point forward, they can still try to manipulate you, but something fundamental has shifted. They can no longer access your emotional center without permission. They can still test you, but every test reveals them, not you. And that's the first taste of true psychological sovereignty, when their attempts at control become your mirror of awareness, when their patterns expose themselves faster than their words can disguise them. That's when the leash finally starts to snap, and that's when you begin to understand. Freedom isn't the absence of guilt, it's the mastery of it. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers, so quietly that only the unbroken can hear it. You were taught that silence means weakness, that the louder voice wins the argument, that explaining yourself proves your worth. But that's not strategy. That's emotional dependency disguised as honesty. True power doesn't chase understanding. It creates confusion in others and comfort within itself, because silence is a mirror, and most people can't stand to face their reflection. When you stop explaining, they start projecting. When you stop defending, they reveal their motives. And when you stop reacting, they panic, not because they lost control of you, but because they lost access to their favorite game, emotional validation. Silence is not the absence of communication. It's the reversal of it. You force others to speak into the void, to fill the gap with their assumptions. Every second they wait for your reaction, they reveal who they are. In that waiting, their mind eats itself, because control thrives on predictability and silence kills prediction. That's why manipulators fear it. They can't function in uncertainty. They need feedback, your emotions, your tone, your explanations, to calibrate their next move. Remove the feedback loop, and they self-destruct. That's the Machiavellian paradox. The less you react, the more control you hold. The more they speak, the more truth they expose. Psychologists call this strategic silence. It's not passive-aggressive, it's emotionally surgical. It allows tension to build, not to punish, but to observe. Because people reveal more in discomfort than in safety. The mask slips fastest in the presence of stillness. This is why every great manipulator tests your silence early. They'll throw emotional bait disguised as vulnerability, a subtle complaint, a guilt-laced question, a half-hearted apology meant to reopen the door you finally locked. They don't care about peace. They care about access. The untrained fall for it every time. They fill the silence with empathy. They explain, comfort, and soothe, unaware that every word they speak reactivates the power imbalance. But the strategist waits. They let the silence stretch until it becomes unbearable, not for themselves, but for the manipulator. Because silence, when weaponized with intent, forces truth to surface. It's not cruelty. It's exposure. Here's the dark psychological mechanism. The human mind craves closure. When denied it, it begins to confess to itself. People will rationalize their own behavior out loud just to escape the unease of not being understood. They'll reveal motives they swore they'd hide. They'll over-explain their lies. They'll sabotage their own deception just to restore emotional equilibrium. That's the true genius of silence. It's not withdrawal. It's provocation without effort. But here's where most fail. They mistake silence for indifference. They use it to punish, not to observe. That's emotional immaturity wearing a mask of control. Real Machiavellian silence isn't reactionary. It's strategic timing. It's the deliberate pause between insight and action. A moment to watch patterns unfold before intervening. You don't stay silent to hurt them. You stay silent to see them. And once you truly see someone, not their mask, but their mechanism, their power dissolves. Because power only exists in what remains unseen. Once it's exposed, it becomes predictable. And predictability is the death of manipulation. You start realizing that silence isn't empty. It's full of information, of leverage, of truth. It's the pause where your emotions catch up to your intellect, where instinct becomes strategy, where chaos reveals its pattern. That's why ancient strategists like Sun Tzu and Machiavelli both revered stillness as a weapon. Not stillness of the body, but of the mind. A silence so internal that nothing external can provoke it. Imagine that. Someone insults you, and your mind doesn't flinch. Someone withdraws affection, and your heart doesn't chase. Someone accuses you of coldness, and you simply watch them, like an actor reading their own script. That's psychological invincibility. Not through domination, but through detachment. Not through ego, but through clarity. And clarity is the one thing the manipulative cannot survive, because their entire game depends on distortion. They live in fog. Your silence burns it away. So the next time you're provoked, remember, not every attack deserves a counterstrike. Some deserve observation, because silence is not the absence of war. It's the art of winning it without fighting. They'll call it arrogance. They'll say you've changed. They'll beg for explanations. Not because they miss you, but because they miss controlling how you see yourself. Let them speak. Let them fill the void. And in that void, let them reveal their truth. Because you've learned something they haven't. Sometimes the loudest declaration of power is saying nothing at all. Would you like me to continue with Part 5, The Art of Detachment, How the Mind Reclaims Power, where the story transitions from defense to transformation, showing how psychological detachment becomes emotional rebirth? They thought silence was your retreat. They didn't realize it was your evolution. When you stop reacting, something remarkable happens, not outside you, but within. The chaos in your chest begins to settle. The storms that once defined you lose their urgency. And for the first time, you begin to sense the difference between pain and clarity. That's what detachment truly is. It's not numbness. It's precision. People confuse detachment with apathy because they've never experienced it from strength, only from exhaustion. They withdraw because they're hurt. You detach because you're awake. There's a crucial difference. Pain-based withdrawal seeks escape. Awakened detachment seeks vision. You no longer run from emotion. You let it pass through you, watching it for what it truly is: information. Anger? A signal of violated boundaries. Sadness? The echo of attachment without reciprocity. Guilt? The weapon they handed you so you'd police yourself on their behalf. Each emotion becomes data, no longer master, but messenger. That's the transformation. Because once you detach, you stop identifying with your emotional reactions. You stop saying, "I am angry." Instead, you observe. Anger is present, and in that subtle shift, power returns to its rightful place, in your perception. That's where manipulators lose their grip. They can't bind you through shame or lure you through praise. Their tools require attachment. You've turned into smoke, untouchable, yet everywhere. Here's the paradox of control. The more you cling to it, the less you have. True power isn't the ability to dictate others. It's the ability to remain unchanged by them. That's detachment, the stillness beneath the storm, the unblinking awareness that doesn't flinch when the world demands a reaction. It's the skill every strategist, every mystic, every Machiavellian master cultivated, not because they wanted to be cold, but because they wanted to see. You cannot see truth through attachment. Attachment distorts. It blinds you with desire, fear, guilt, all the tools of manipulation. But when you detach, something terrifying happens for those who once controlled you. They lose their ability to predict you. You no longer mirror their emotions. You no longer fall for the push-pull, the praise-punish cycle, the invisible leash of emotional approval. They'll call you distant, heartless, robotic. That's their fear talking, because your emotional independence reminds them of their own fragility. But inside you, there's peace. Cold, calm, radiant peace. You begin to understand what Machiavelli meant when he said, "Men are driven by two principal impulses, either by love or by fear." When you detach, neither can move you. You're driven by clarity, and clarity is immune to manipulation. Think of detachment as psychological minimalism. You strip away everything that doesn't serve your stability. You stop over-explaining. You stop overthinking. You stop giving people more access than their integrity can handle. You start measuring connections not by comfort, but by energy. Who adds chaos? Who adds clarity? Who mirrors your peace? And who disturbs it? And slowly, your world rearranges itself. The noise fades. The shadows thin. What remains are only those aligned with your evolution, not your ego's hunger for approval. That's the hidden reward of detachment. It filters reality. It burns away illusions. You begin to see who was truly with you, and who was only using your warmth to escape their own coldness. Psychologically, this is known as emotional recalibration. Your nervous system stops confusing chaos for connection. You no longer feel alive through conflict or validation. You feel alive through peace. And that peace? It becomes addictive. Once you taste it, you'll never beg for belonging again. Because the need to belong is where control begins. People will exploit your hunger for acceptance long before they threaten your freedom. They'll make you choose between being understood and being yourself. But when you detach, you choose neither. You choose truth. Here's the cruel wisdom you'll carry from now on. The more you need to be seen, the easier you are to control. The less you explain, the more unpredictable you become. And unpredictability is the purest form of freedom. That's why detachment feels lonely at first, because you've stepped out of the herd. You've stopped speaking the language of guilt and flattery. You've stopped orbiting around validation. And so, yes, the silence feels vast. But that's not emptiness. That's capacity. Capacity for peace, for precision, for power that doesn't have to shout. Most people never reach this stage. They fear the void too much. They'd rather stay entangled in noise than face themselves in silence. But you've crossed that threshold. You've learned that detachment isn't isolation. It's self-possession. You own your reactions now. You own your emotions. You own your narrative. And that ownership, that invisible fortress, is what every manipulator secretly envies. Because once you master detachment, they can't touch you anymore. They can only circle you, waiting for a reaction that never comes. And when they finally realize they no longer live rent-free in your mind, that's when the real power shift begins. Because the one who controls their emotions controls the entire game. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't roar or demand or plead to be noticed. It watches and it waits. When you finally step into that quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, you begin to see the world through a colder, clearer lens. You see how easily people surrender themselves for the illusion of belonging, how they trade authenticity for approval, and how they dress weakness in moral clothing, calling it kindness, loyalty, or forgiveness, when really, it's fear in disguise. You've seen it before, in others, and maybe once, in yourself. That subtle craving to be understood, that ache for validation. It's the oldest form of slavery, because whoever defines your worth owns you. And that's the quiet truth society never wants you to realize. The moment you let someone else decide who you are, you've already forfeited your power. That's why the masters of power, the truly dangerous ones, always start with self-definition. They know that once you master your inner world, the outer world bends. But if you remain ruled by guilt, empathy, and the desire to be good, you will forever be ruled by those who aren't. That's the cruel paradox. Evil often wins not because it's stronger, but because good refuses to be strategic. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. He didn't worship cruelty. He dissected it. He studied how morality blinds people to manipulation, and he realized goodness, without strength, is just another form of weakness waiting to be used. So here's the awakening. You don't need to abandon empathy. You need to weaponize it. Direct it with precision. Know when to feel and when to observe, when to speak and when silence will strike harder, when to forgive and when forgiveness is just permission for them to wound you again. Because morality without discernment is chaos, and discernment is the soul of power. You begin to see that life isn't about winning or losing, it's about understanding leverage. Every interaction, every betrayal, every silence is an exchange of energy. The wise don't waste theirs on being right, they spend it on positioning. You start to understand the invisible layers beneath every human connection. Attention is currency. Emotion is leverage. Perception is control. And those who master perception master reality itself. That's why true power feels lonely, because few people can stand at that height without wanting to descend again, back into the comfort of approval, the warmth of belonging. But you've crossed the threshold. You've tasted a colder freedom. You've realized that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of clarity. That control isn't domination. It's the refusal to be moved by chaos. And that love, when it's real, never demands you shrink to fit someone else's comfort. Now, you understand why they call it dark psychology. Not because it's evil, but because it exposes the shadows everyone else avoids. The shadow of manipulation, the shadow of guilt, the shadow of your own naivety. You had to walk through them to become this version of yourself. A version that doesn't flinch, that doesn't explain, that doesn't seek permission to exist. That's the transformation. Not louder, not crueler, but colder, refined, strategic, unapologetically aware. And when you move through the world now, people will feel it. They'll sense something in your energy, a calm they can't decipher, a silence that unsettles them. They'll try to provoke you just to find your limits. They'll fail, because your power is no longer in your reactions, it's in your restraint. You've learned that control isn't about holding others, it's about holding yourself. You've turned every betrayal into data, every loss into leverage, every emotion into intelligence. This is where emotional pain evolves into wisdom, where your weakness became your armor, where your empathy became your strategy. And maybe one day, someone will ask how you became this way, so poised, so untouchable, so eerily calm. You'll smile, not with arrogance, but with the kind of peace that only those who've walked through fire can know, because they'll never understand the cost of your clarity. How many illusions you had to burn, how many versions of yourself had to die so you could rise this detached, this deliberate, this powerful. You won't need to explain. You'll simply walk away, leaving them wondering which version of you they ever truly knew. And as you disappear into that quiet certainty, one truth will echo in your mind, the final lesson of all Machiavellian wisdom. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And when yours was revealed, it didn't destroy you, it refined you. Because you finally understood, control isn't taken by force. It's taken by awareness, by stillness, by silence. And that's when you stop being kind and start being powerful.